Nobody finds out their parachute was packed wrong until they're already falling. Not before the jump, not standing at the door of the aircraft with wind in their face. During the fall, that's when they find out the fabric has a problem. That's when the real test happens and there is no second attempt. Millions of American households built what looked from every measurable angle like solid financial security. They saved consistently. They kept expenses below income. They avoided the obvious traps. And when a real crisis arrived, a sudden job loss, a medical emergency, a market correction at exactly the wrong moment, what collapsed wasn't their savings balance. It was the architecture beneath it, the structure nobody had ever bothered to inspect. Because most of us were never taught to inspect it. There's a version of financial protection that looks correct from the outside. Emergency fund in place, savings growing month over month, no high-interest debt pulling current income backward. And beneath all of it, a quiet, mostly unexamined assumption that when something goes seriously wrong, the protection will hold. That assumption is the part almost no one ever tests. The difference between a financial safety net that holds under genuine pressure and one that quietly fails at the moment of maximum need is almost never about how much was saved. It's about whether 5 specific structural signs are present, signs that are measurable, observable, and almost never discussed in the same conversation as emergency funds. Here's why this matters right now, not eventually, not theoretically. If any of these 5 signs are absent from your financial foundation today, you are already carrying exposure that compounds quietly each month. Not dramatically, not with any visible warning. The way a hairline crack in a load-bearing wall spreads without announcing itself until the load arrives. This is a diagnostic. 5 concrete questions, each with a specific answer that you can find about your own situation. By the end, you'll know exactly where your financial safety net is structurally sound, and where, if anything, needs to be reinforced before a real crisis makes the inspection for you. The first sign has to do with a distinction that most emergency fund guidance completely ignores. The standard advice is to save 3 to 6 months of expenses, your monthly expenses, what you spend on housing, utilities, groceries, and the minimum obligations that keep life functional. That framework is not wrong. It's incomplete in a way that matters enormously under pressure. Your cost of living and the real cost of replacing your income source are not the same number. If your income depends on a specific industry, on a professional network built over years, or on a business structure that takes time to restart, the realistic timeline for full income recovery after an unexpected disruption may be substantially longer than the generic 3 to 6 month window assumes. And that gap, between what your emergency fund covers and what your specific situation actually requires, doesn't show up on any balance sheet. It only shows up when you're drawing down the fund and the income hasn't come back yet. The first sign your financial safety net will hold. Your emergency fund is sized to cover the realistic income replacement timeline for your specific situation, not the standardized estimate that applies to everyone and therefore fits no one precisely. Ask yourself, if your primary income disappeared tomorrow, how long would it realistically take to rebuild it, not find a temporary alternative, but rebuild income at the level your current obligations require? That number is your actual target, not the generic one. The second sign involves something that financial diversification advice almost always gets backwards. Most people hear diversification and think about types of accounts, a savings account and an investment account, maybe a retirement fund alongside both, multiple instruments in separate places. That is instrument diversification. It is not scenario diversification, and they are not the same protection. Scenario diversification means your financial protection can address different categories of risk independently, and specifically, that it can handle an income disruption and a simultaneous market downturn without forcing a liquidation of long-term assets during the downturn. A job loss during a market correction is not a rare scenario. Job losses and market downturns tend to cluster. They share economic root causes and arrive together more often than intuition suggests. When they overlap, a household that holds liquid emergency savings alongside market-linked investments faces a specific problem. The savings is there, but once it runs out, the next layer of protection requires selling investments at depressed prices. That's a structural failure, not a savings failure. The money exists. The architecture was just built for one emergency at a time. The second sign, your financial protection explicitly addresses the scenario where income stops and markets fall simultaneously, with instruments that don't require you to sell long-term assets at a loss to bridge the gap. This is where most emergency fund conversations stop. 3 to 6 months of expenses kept liquid and accessible, that's the framework, and it works for what it was designed to do. It was designed for single-event emergencies, one disruption at a time, and most of the time that's exactly what happens. But the crises that actually cause financial safety nets to collapse are almost never single event. They're simultaneous, they're overlapping. And the protection built for the single event scenario carries an invisible load limit when two stressors arrive at once. Understanding this isn't pessimism, it's knowing what your parachute was actually packed for. The third sign requires knowing something most people who have income protection coverage don't actually know about their own policy. Disability insurance, employer-provided or private, covers a gap in income that health insurance doesn't touch. Most people are broadly aware it exists. Far fewer know the specific terms of their own coverage, what the elimination period is, meaning how long income must be absent before benefits begin, whether benefits are calculated on gross or net income, whether the plan covers the insured's specific occupation or only general employability. The income protection coverage gap is the distance between when income stops and when any formal replacement begins. That gap is almost always larger than people expect, and it is the exact window that a liquid emergency fund should be explicitly sized to bridge, not approximately, not based on an assumption that coverage begins quickly, based on the actual elimination period in the actual policy. The third sign, you know the specific terms of your income protection coverage, and your emergency fund is sized to bridge the elimination period with precision, calculated, not estimated. The fourth sign involves something that happens to emergency funds over time, that gets almost no attention in standard financial security conversations. An emergency fund built 2 or 3 years ago to cover 6 months of expenses covers less than 6 months of expenses today. Not because anything was spent, because both the cost of living and the realistic timeline for income replacement have increased. The number in the account looks identical. The protection it provides has quietly contracted. Most people review their emergency fund balance on some periodic basis. Fewer people review whether the balance still covers the same duration it was originally designed to cover, accounting for current expense levels, current income replacement timelines, and the compound effect of inflation on purchasing power. The fourth sign, your emergency fund has been recalibrated within the last 12 months against current expense levels and current income replacement assumptions, not just checked against the original targets from when it was first built. So here's where this lands. You've done the right things, you saved, you avoided the obvious errors, and there's a real possibility that 3 or 4 of these signs are already present in your financial foundation. But if even one of them is absent, the income replacement sizing, the scenario diversification, the gap coverage precision, the erosion recalibration, you're carrying a structural vulnerability that produces no visible signal until the moment of maximum pressure. Not before, during. The fifth sign is the one that determines whether the other 4 actually function as a system, or exist as separate components that were never assembled into a coherent architecture. It is the presence of a documented protocol, not a mental note, not a general intention, a written sequence of decisions that establishes in advance exactly what to do in what order if a real financial crisis arrives. Here is why this matters more than it sounds. Financial decisions made under acute stress are structurally different from decisions made under calm analytical conditions. Under stress, people underestimate timelines, overestimate their ability to course correct, and make withdrawal decisions that feel protective in the immediate moment but reduce long-term stability. This is not a personal weakness. It is how human cognition responds to pressure, consistently, across all income levels and education backgrounds. A documented protocol means the decision-making happened before the crisis, when thinking was clear, when numbers were available, when options could be evaluated without the acceleration of an active emergency. It means knowing in advance, this is the account drawn from first. This is the threshold at which professional guidance gets involved. This is the timeline at which the plan gets reassessed if income hasn't returned. Without that protocol, the other 4 signs are load-bearing walls that were installed in the right places but never connected to a roof. The components are there, the system isn't. If you recognized yourself in any part of this, if one of these 5 signs raised a question you didn't have an immediate, specific answer to, that's not a problem. It's information. And information gathered before a crisis is the only kind that's actually actionable. Parachutes can be repacked, load-bearing walls can be reinforced, emergency funds can be recalibrated, insurance policies can be reviewed, protocols can be written. Every single one of these adjustments is possible right now today with no pressure and no urgency because the crisis hasn't arrived yet. That window stays open exactly as long as you don't need it. What this diagnostic reveals isn't usually a catastrophic structural failure. It's usually 1 or 2 precision gaps, an emergency fund sized to a generic timeline instead of a specific income reality, or a protocol that exists as an intention rather than a document. The households that discover their safety net was missing something don't find out slowly. They find out at once in the middle of the thing when the speed of the situation makes it impossible to think clearly enough to fill the gap they're falling through. The households whose protection held didn't save more. They built more deliberately. Someone had asked these 5 questions before they were forced to answer them under pressure. Pick one sign, the one that raised the sharpest question, and get a clear, specific answer to it this week. Not eventually, this week. That's what the window is for. If this gave you a clearer picture of where your own financial safety net stands, subscribe for more straightforward content on capital preservation, income protection, and building long-term financial security that actually holds when you need it to.